grand mating altar of the solstice spire was a suffocating monument to aesthetic vanity. Golden silk banners whipped in the crisp mountain wind, while 1,000 elite nobles watched the royal ceremony with hollow, expectant eyes. Lyra stood before the towering alpha King Valen, her rough, calloused hands clutching not a delicate bouquet of rare blooming lilies, but a heavy rolled canvas parchment. It was a massive, comprehensive blueprint perfectly engineered to save the collapsing lower wards from structural ruin. Valen stared down at her from his pristine marble throne, his piercing silver eyes flashing with absolute aristocratic disgust. He violently unrolled the thick canvas, seeing only crude lines of dirt and stone instead of the romantic, poetic vows he inherently demanded. "You dare bring the filthy geometry of the slums to my sacred altar, Lyra," he projected, his thunderous voice vibrating against the polished marble pillars, completely shattering the silent tension. "You possess absolutely no regal grace, no majestic vision, and no royal soul. You're nothing but an emotionless contractor obsessed with mud and failing bricks. I completely reject you as my fated mate." He cast the heavy blueprint onto the polished stone floor, his heavy silver boot brutally crushing the precise architectural lines that could have saved thousands of innocent lives. "You belong in the collapsing dark. I banish you to the lower wards permanently." Lyra stared at the ruined parchment, her brilliant mind already calculating the horrific structural cost of his blind arrogance. Which country are you listening from? Please comment below. I would love to know how far this story reached. The lower wards were a terrifying, chaotic labyrinth of rotting timber and failing stone. Far beneath the polished, gleaming spires of the capital, the impoverished masses lived in a perpetual, suffocating twilight. The air down here did not smell of blooming royal gardens or sweet, expensive incense. It was heavy, with the sharp, acidic tang of stagnant water and crumbling mortar. Lyra moved through the claustrophobic alleys, her worn leather boots stepping carefully over jagged cracks in the paving stones. She did not walk with the shattered, fragile posture of a broken, exiled Omega. She walked with the absolute, focused intensity of a master architect, reading the secret, desperate language of a dying city. To the arrogant nobility walking above, the slums were simply a filthy blemish on their majestic landscape. But Lyra did not see filth. She saw a massive, complex system of civic failure, actively crying out for structural salvation. Her brilliant silver eyes rapidly scanned the heavy load-bearing walls of the leaning tenements, instantly calculating the terrifying kinetic strain placed upon the rotting wooden beams. She noted the dangerous pooling of dark water near the main aqueduct supports, mapping the highly corrosive erosion happening completely out of sight. She reached her hidden sanctuary, a small, drafty subterranean chamber located directly beneath the roaring market district. It was entirely devoid of luxurious silk tapestries or soft, feathered beds. Her room was completely dominated by a massive scarred oak drafting table completely covered in thick stacks of rough canvas and complex geometrical tools. This was her true kingdom. She dropped her heavy satchel onto the floorboards, pulling out a thick piece of charcoal and leaning over a massive sprawling map of the lower wards. Her heavily calloused hands moved across the rough parchment with breathtaking, flawless precision. She was not drawing a simple picture. She was actively performing life-saving civic surgery on the failing anatomy of the capital. She darkened the lines representing the southern retaining wall, heavily noting the severe microscopic fractures she had discovered that morning. The elite royal architects completely ignored the immense subterranean pressure building beneath their pristine marble streets, preferring to build taller, superficial towers rather than maintain the foundational bedrock. But Lyra understood the absolute, undeniable truth of physics. A crown of heavy polished gold cannot sit upon a rotting spine. She spent her grueling days completely swallowed by the shadows moving silently through the dangerous collapsing sectors. She became an invisible guardian, a phantom engineer, meticulously reinforcing the failing infrastructure without a single word of gratitude or recognition. When a heavy stone archway threatened to collapse over a crowded orphanage, she spent 3 exhausting nights wedging thick ironwood braces into the hidden stress points, utilizing pure leverage and mathematical logic to completely redirect the massive crushing weight. When the eastern drainage canals clogged with highly toxic debris, she silently designed and installed an ingenious hydraulic siphon system, perfectly clearing the stagnant water before the deadly fever could spread through the vulnerable population. She lived entirely for the sacred grid. The absolute staggering weight of her daily physical labor permanently stained her hands with dark mud and gray stone dust, but she wore the grime like a badge of absolute sovereign honor. She did not need King Valen or his superficial aristocratic court to validate her existence. She possessed the towering, undeniable power to actively bend the raw elements of the earth to her brilliant will. Every single fortified wall, every reinforced timber, and every cleared aqueduct was a silent, heavy blow against the corrupt, oppressive hierarchy that had so violently discarded her. As the dim sunlight faded entirely from the narrow grates above her subterranean chamber, Lyra leaned back from her massive drafting table. The muscles in her back ached with a profound heavy exhaustion, but her mind was fiercely razor-sharp. She stared intensely at the highly detailed blueprint of the central subterranean water vault. It was the absolute critical heart of the entire city, holding back the massive pressure of the northern river. The royal engineers claimed it was an indestructible marvel of ancient architecture, perfectly safe and eternally secure. But Lyra saw the terrifying hidden flaw. A massive intricate web of dark charcoal lines completely covered the center of her map, pointing directly toward a catastrophic structural anomaly. The ancient stone was not simply aging. It was actively violently splintering under an unprecedented immense tectonic strain. The foundational bedrock of the grand capital was shifting, and the majestic marble city above was completely, utterly blind to the impending apocalypse. A sudden violent tremor ripped through the drafty chamber, violently shaking her heavy oak table and sending a thick shower of gray dust raining down from the stone ceiling. The thick charcoal stick snapped instantly in her calloused hand. The terrifying deep rumble did not stop. It echoed through the dark tunnels, carrying the heavy agonizing groan of shattering stone and failing iron. The massive structural collapse she had meticulously predicted was no longer a quiet theoretical threat living on her canvas parchment. It had just actively violently begun. The violent subterranean tremor violently rattled the foundation of her hidden sanctuary, but Lyra did not freeze in terror. Her mind instantly shifted into a state of towering absolute clinical calculation. The deep agonizing groan echoing through the claustrophobic tunnels was a highly specific acoustic signature. It was the terrifying, unmistakable sound of heavy load-bearing granite fracturing under immense aquatic pressure. She grabbed her heavy leather satchel, stuffing it with thick, heavy iron pitons, a heavy forged hammer, and dense coils of woven hemp rope. She sprinted directly into the suffocating dust storm, filling the narrow alleyways of the lower wards, ignoring the terrified screams of the impoverished citizens fleeing in blind panic. She was charging directly into the crushing center of the disaster, entirely prepared to sacrifice her own fragile life to maintain the absolute structural integrity of the dark slums. She navigated the chaotic pitch-black labyrinth entirely by memory, perfectly understanding the complex spatial geometry of the slums better than the lines on her own calloused palms. She burst through a rusted iron grate, arriving at the massive subterranean aqueduct, serving as the primary arterial water supply for the entire eastern sector. The scene was an absolute structural nightmare. The massive central support pillar, a colossal column of ancient gray stone, was violently buckling. A terrifying web of deep, jagged cracks aggressively spiderwebbed up the heavy stone, weeping high pressure. If that pillar shattered, the upper reservoir would violently collapse, instantly drowning thousands of innocent people trapped in the claustrophobic lower wards. The royal architects of the Grand Marble Pavilion would have declared the violently buckling stone an absolute lost cause, ordering an immediate brutal quarantine of the slums to protect the upper city. But Lyra possessed a terrifying supreme architectural genius that completely defied their arrogant limitations. She did not see an inevitable collapse. She saw a complex mathematical equation of kinetic force and gravitational pressure desperately demanding an immediate counterweight. She sprinted toward the failing pillar, splashing heavily through the rapidly rising freezing water. Her brilliant silver eyes rapidly scanned the massive vaulted ceiling, perfectly calculating the geometric angles of the surrounding secondary support beams. The massive failing pillar was carrying far too much vertical compression, but the adjacent ancient ironwood arches were incredibly dense and severely underutilized. She needed to actively transfer the crushing kinetic load before the granite completely surrendered. Working with breathtaking mechanical ferocity, she swung her heavy forged hammer, violently driving thick iron pitons deep into the solid bedrock adjacent to the buckling pillar. The deafening metallic clangs echoed sharply over the terrifying roar of the rushing water. Her muscles burned with intense physical agony, but her mind remained an absolute fortress of structural logic. She rapidly secured the dense coils of woven hemp rope to the heavy iron pitons, creating a massive complex network of high-tension support lines. She threw the heavy ropes over the adjacent ironwood arches, creating a flawless makeshift pulley system designed to actively distribute the catastrophic structural weight. Every single second was an agonizing race against the crushing physics of the earth. The massive granite pillar let out another deafening crack, a huge chunk of heavy stone violently exploding outward and plunging into the dark, rushing water. The immense ceiling visibly sagged, entirely ready to completely cave in and deliver an absolute aquatic apocalypse. Lyra grabbed the thick, heavy main-tension rope, her heavily calloused hands instantly bleeding as the rough hemp violently bit into her palms. She threw her entire body weight backward, utilizing pure flawless leverage and perfect geometric angles to actively fight the crushing weight of a collapsing mountain. She wrapped the bleeding rope around her waist, planting her worn leather boots firmly against a massive block of solid stone. The raw kinetic strain placed upon her fragile physical body was absolutely staggering, tearing at her muscles and threatening to snap her spine. The arrogant alpha King Valen had publicly humiliated her, calling her an emotionless contractor obsessed with failing bricks. He was entirely fundamentally wrong. Her profound obsession with the sacred grid was the purest absolute form of love. It was the fierce, unyielding devotion to protect the vulnerable, invisible masses that his polished golden crown completely ignored. She let out a deep, agonizing roar of supreme effort, locking the heavy tension lines entirely into place. The incredibly complex network of heavy ropes pulled violently taut, vibrating with a terrifying high-pitched hum under the immense kinetic load. For one agonizing silent heartbeat, the entire subterranean world completely held its breath. Then the terrifying buckling of the massive granite pillar abruptly ceased. The flawless mathematical transfer of kinetic force was an absolute miraculous success. The heavy ironwood arches actively absorbed the staggering vertical pressure, stabilizing the failing ceiling and completely halting the impending catastrophic flood. Lyra collapsed to her knees in the freezing dark water, her lungs burning and her scarred hands bleeding freely. She had successfully engineered an absolute miracle in the shadows, saving thousands of innocent lives without a single royal guard ever knowing the terrifying danger they had survived. She looked up at the massive stabilized ceiling, a profound, deep satisfaction settling into her exhausted bones, but the quiet triumph was instantly shattered by a massive, deafening explosion echoing from the far northern tunnels, indicating that the structural nightmare was only just beginning. The massive, deafening explosion echoing from the far northern tunnels violently ripped through the freezing water, vibrating directly into the marrow of her exhausted bones. It was not just the terrifying acoustic signature of shattering stone. To Lyra, it was the exact identical sound of her childhood, violently ending. The dark subterranean aqueduct instantly dissolved around her, completely replaced by the suffocating, heavy gray dust of a horrific memory she could never escape. She was 10 years old again, standing in the claustrophobic, crowded kitchen of a towering, rotting tenement deep in the heart of the lower wards. The corrupt royal council had recently commissioned the construction of a massive, pristine marble amphitheater in the upper city directly above their fragile sector. They aggressively drove heavy iron pylons deep into the earth entirely, ignoring the devastating kinetic shockwaves, violently fracturing the fragile, ancient foundations of the slums directly below. To the arrogant nobility, the impoverished residents were simply invisible dirt, meant to be crushed under the staggering weight of their superficial aesthetic vanity. The memory played out with terrifying, agonizing clarity, completely paralyzing her breathing. First came the deep, unnatural groan of the heavy load-bearing timber, violently splintering under an impossible vertical strain. The walls aggressively bowed inward, shedding thick sheets of gray plaster like dead skin. Then the entire chaotic world aggressively, violently tilted, plunging the crowded tenement into absolute catastrophic freefall. Lyra remembered the sudden absolute darkness and the deafening catastrophic roar of a massive building completely surrendering to gravity. She remembered the terrifying, violent kinetic impact throwing her small, fragile body violently against the rotting floorboards. But mostly, she remembered the blinding, suffocating cloud of thick gray mortar dust and the massive, heavy ironwood ceiling beam actively plunging directly toward her fragile skull. She would have been instantly crushed, completely erased from the brutal world if not for the fierce, unyielding kinetic force of her mother. The fierce Omega had thrown her own fragile body violently over Lyra's, creating a desperate physical shield against the crushing architectural apocalypse. The heavy ironwood beam struck with devastating absolute finality, violently pinning her mother to the shattered floorboards under thousands of pounds of unrelenting deadweight. Lyra remembered coughing violently, the thick gray dust completely coating her throat as she blindly reached out in the terrifying claustrophobic dark. Her small, trembling fingers found the cold, damp cheek of her mother. The fierce woman was bleeding heavily, her chest violently compressed beneath the massive splintered timber. But her pale silver eyes burned with a profound, absolute, unyielding fire that refused to be extinguished by the collapsing earth. "Do not close your eyes, Lyra," her mother whispered, her voice a ragged, agonizing rasp barely audible over the terrifying screams of the dying tenement. "Look at the broken wood. Look at the failing stone. You must understand exactly why it falls. You must master the heavy earth so it can never crush the innocent again." Her mother did not weep, and she did not beg the indifferent universe for a miraculous salvation. She spent her absolute, final, agonizing breath demanding her young daughter completely weaponize her towering intellect. As the fierce silver light permanently faded from her mother's eyes, the 10-year-old girl completely shattered beneath the oppressive weight of the ruins. But the broken pieces of her fragile soul did not simply blow away in the toxic dust. They aggressively reformed instantly, forging an absolute, unyielding core of pure structural logic and profound civic fury. The elite royal architects arrived 3 days later, not to rescue the buried victims, but to formally assess the structural damage to their precious marble amphitheater above. Lyra had stood silently in the freezing rain, her small hands permanently stained with the dark blood of her mother, listening to the arrogant men casually dismiss the horrific collapse as unavoidable natural settling. They blamed the fragile, rotting timber, entirely refusing to acknowledge their heavy iron pylons had actively murdered hundreds of innocent people simply to build a stage for their useless theatrical. In that absolute freezing tragic silence, Lyra made a sacred, unbreakable vow to the universe. She would learn the profound hidden language of the heavy stone. She would completely master the sacred geometric grid of the world. She would become the absolute terrifying architect of a new civic dawn. And she would permanently dismantle the corrupt, oppressive hierarchy that treated human lives as disposable architectural collateral. She would build a foundation so perfectly equal that a golden crown would weigh exactly the same as a commoner's heavy iron shovel. The violent, icy water of the subterranean aqueduct aggressively washed over her calloused hands, instantly snapping her brilliant mind back to the terrifying present reality. The massive northern tunnels were completely collapsing. She pulled her bruised, aching body upward, her pale silver eyes locking onto the dark, flooded passageway leading directly toward the upper city. The catastrophic structural failure was not just destroying the lower wards anymore. The massive, deafening echoes carried the unmistakable, distinct sound of shattering pristine marble and tearing gold and silk. The absolute, invincible royal palace of Alpha King Valen was actively, violently falling into the dark, and the arrogant elite were completely, utterly trapped. The grand throne room of the Solstice Spire was the absolute glittering zenith of the known world. Alpha King Valen stood at the towering crystal windows overlooking his sprawling, majestic capital, completely insulated from the gritty reality of the earth below. The floors were cut from flawless white marble, imported from distant pristine quarries, and the towering columns were entirely wrapped in heavy braided gold. His royal architects had spent decades ensuring the palace was an absolute masterpiece of aesthetic perfection, actively designing every single sweeping arch to maximize the natural sunlight and display the overwhelming wealth of his ancient bloodline. To Valen, this towering fortress of light and beauty was the ultimate physical manifestation of his absolute invincible power. He was the undisputed sovereign of the realm, a terrifying alpha warrior whose mere presence commanded the absolute submission of entire armies. He possessed absolutely no reason to doubt the permanence of his golden crown. But gravity is a fiercely impartial judge, completely unimpressed by royal decrees or ancient bloodlines. The first terrifying indication of the impending apocalypse was incredibly subtle. A single heavy crystal goblet resting on his polished mahogany table began to vibrate, emitting a high-pitched crystalline hum. Valen turned his intense silver gaze away from the bright, panoramic windows, his sharp alpha instincts instantly detecting the deep, unnatural tension, actively suffocating the vast open room. He felt it deep within the marrow of his heavy bones, a terrifying low-frequency vibration that aggressively bypassed his raw physical strength, completely challenging the heavy stone beneath his boot. Then the absolute invincible world violently shattered. A massive, deafening roar violently erupted from the deep subterranean depths, completely eclipsing the gentle orchestral music playing in the royal corridors. The flawless white marble floor aggressively, violently heaved, throwing the towering Alpha King hard against the polished stone. The sheer kinetic force of the deep tectonic shift was absolutely staggering, violently ripping the heavy golden tapestries directly from their mounting brackets. The soaring vaulted ceiling, completely covered in intricate, priceless frescoes, began to aggressively buckle, raining thick, sharp sheets of painted plaster down upon the terrified, screaming nobility. Valen scrambled to his heavy leather boots, his massive chest heaving as he instinctively reached for his broadsword. But his terrifying martial prowess was completely, utterly useless against the crushing kinetic wrath of the heavy stone. He could not fight a violently collapsing ceiling with a sharpened blade. He could not order the aggressive tectonic plates to yield to his royal authority. He roared for his elite royal guard, but his thunderous voice was entirely swallowed by the terrifying, agonizing groan of massive load-bearing pillars violently snapping under an impossible vertical strain. The towering eastern wall, a massive expanse of stained glass, depicting his legendary ancestors, aggressively, violently exploded. A terrifying shower of razor-sharp, colorful shrapnel violently tore through the grand throne room, shattering against the heavy armor of his royal guard. The aristocratic courtiers who had spent their entire lives hoarding immense wealth and mocking the invisible peasants below were completely paralyzed by blind, pathetic terror. They scrambled over each other, weeping and screaming, entirely forgetting their poised regal grace as the heavy aesthetic arches violently collapsed around them, burying their expensive silks beneath tons of shattered rubble. "Secure the central load-bearing columns," Valen roared, his thunderous voice carrying absolute, desperate authority. "Where are the grand architects?" His chief engineer, a frail, arrogant duke wearing heavy velvet robes completely unsuited for the brutal chaos, stumbled out from beneath a shattered mahogany table. His pale aristocratic face was completely drained of its usual elitist contempt, entirely replaced by a pathetic whimpering panic. "We cannot hold the massive weight, my king," he choked out, dodging a violently plunging iron chandelier. The heavy aesthetic arches were never designed to withstand an active subterranean kinetic shock. They are purely decorative. The central foundation is completely aggressively fading. The entire majestic spire is violently sinking into the dark. The crushing absolute truth of the architect's panicked confession struck Valen harder than a heavy iron warhammer. He had completely trusted these men because their polished blueprints looked beautiful on thick, expensive parchment. He had violently rejected Lyra and banished her to the toxic, rotting slums because her complex mathematical grid offended his shallow, superficial eyes. He had demanded aesthetic perfection instead of structural salvation, and now his towering, majestic vanity was actively, violently murdering his entire court. His grand kingdom was nothing but a fragile, hollow shell, completely devoid of a true heavy spine. The floor of the grand throne room aggressively split wide open, revealing a terrifying, massive dark chasm tearing directly through the absolute center of the palace. The deep, jagged fissure aggressively widened, instantly swallowing the pristine marble throne and pulling dozens of screaming nobles directly down into the violent, crushing dark. Valen dove frantically across the violently pitching floorboards, his heavy fingers desperately grabbing the jagged edge of a shattered marble pillar to completely prevent himself from falling into the deep abyss. He hung precariously over the violent dark void, the heavy gold chains of his royal cloak aggressively pulling him toward the crushing destruction below. He looked down into the terrifying cavernous depths, expecting to see absolute chaotic ruin and massive flooding. But as his sharp alpha vision pierced the swirling gray dust, he saw something absolutely impossible. Far beneath the violently collapsing ruins of his pristine marble city, the lower wards were completely, entirely stable. He could clearly see the thick, heavy ironwood braces and perfectly angled kinetic support lines actively holding the deep subterranean sector perfectly intact while his golden empire violently crumbled above. The structural salvation he desperately needed was not resting in his royal archives. It was actively thriving in the exact filthy slums he had violently rejected. The terrifying deep chasm violently widened above him, snapping the heavy marble pillar entirely off its base. The invincible Alpha King lost his desperate physical grip, plunging violently directly down into the terrifying deep dark abyss of the very sector he had so arrogantly despised, completely at the absolute merciless whim of the gravity he had foolishly ignored. The wind howled in Valen's ears, a deafening rush of cold air as he plummeted through the lightless void. He clamped his jaws shut, bracing his heavy muscular frame for the crushing impact of jagged bedrock. He was the Alpha King, a warrior who had conquered rival nations with a swing of his broadsword. Yet gravity cared nothing for his titles. He was falling, cast out of his shattered golden tower like a discarded stone. But the fatal impact never arrived. He slammed into a massive giving web. Thick woven hemp ropes groaned under his sudden weight. The ingenious net stretched, absorbing his terminal velocity before snapping back, launching him sideways. He crashed onto a slick granite ledge, his heavy armor scraping a long trail of sparks against the wet stone before he finally slid to a halt. He lay flat on his back, gasping for air. His lungs burned. Above him, the jagged ceiling of the cavern framed a terrifying window into the upper world. Chunks of pristine white marble and shattered statues plummeted from the ruined solstice spire, plunging into the dark waters far below. His untouchable empire was gone. Valen forced himself onto his hands and knees. His ribs ached, but his bones were intact. He stood up, shaking the stagnant water from his cloak, and turned his gaze toward the sprawling expanse of the lower wards. He braced himself for a scene of unimaginable slaughter. The impoverished slums, built of rotting timber and failing mortar, should have been instantly pulverized by the tectonic shockwaves of the palace collapsing. He expected to hear the dying screams of the forgotten masses. He expected a watery graveyard. Yet, as his silver eyes adjusted to the dim, flickering light of scattered oil lanterns, the reality struck him harder than his fall. The lower wards were standing. They were not merely surviving, they were holding the line against the wrath of the earth. Valen walked to the edge of the causeway, his mind struggling to process the impossible structural logic surrounding him. Massive load-bearing granite pillars, which should have buckled hours ago, were tightly wrapped in complex networks of high-tension ropes and thick iron bands. Giant ironwood braces, angled with flawless mathematical precision, absorbed the crushing vertical weight of the ceiling. Below the causeway, the subterranean river raged, but it was completely contained. Towering levees built from scavenged timber and packed earth cleanly deflected the violent current. An ingenious array of hydraulic siphons hummed quietly in the shadows, efficiently draining the dangerous overflow into deeper, empty caverns. He stepped off the ledge, venturing deeper into the fortified grid. He reached out, pressing his bare palm against a thick ironwood support beam. The wood was cold and damp. He traced the head of a massive iron piton driven deep into the solid bedrock. He could see the fresh, deep gouges of a forging hammer. This was not the chaotic work of a panicking mob. This was deliberate. This was the masterpiece of a singular, towering intellect. He pictured Lyra. He saw her rough, calloused hands holding that rolled canvas blueprint at the grand mating altar. He remembered the scorn in his own voice as he crushed her precise architectural lines beneath his heavy silver boot. He had demanded romantic vows, silk dresses, and empty poetic grace. He had demanded a fragile ornament to sit silently beside him on a throne. Instead, the universe had offered him the architect of salvation, and he had thrown her into the dirt because his shallow eyes could not see the beauty of her grid. A sickening wave of profound regret washed over him. His chest tightened, a heavy, suffocating ache blooming beneath his ribs. The invincible Alpha King suddenly felt infinitesimally small. His glittering crown was a lie. His majestic palace was a tomb. And the woman he had banished, the Omega, he had publicly humiliated, was currently holding the entire failing Earth together in the dark. The primal bond buried deep within his blood flared to life. It was no longer a quiet hum, it was a roaring, undeniable demand. He needed to find her. He needed to drop to his knees in the mud and beg for the mercy of her towering genius. Valen broke into a run, his heavy boots pounding against the stabilized paving stones. He sprinted past abandoned market stalls and empty tenements. The usual stench of rotting garbage was gone, replaced by the clean, sharp smell of newly exposed limestone and wet timber. She had not only fortified the walls, she had reorganized the airflow, turning a suffocating trap into a breathing, functional bunker. The realization only deepened his shame. He had ruled the surface with an iron fist while she nurtured the foundation. The slums were empty, quiet, and secure, but the earth was not done fighting. As he reached the central junction, the ambient air pressure dropped sharply. A foul smell of stagnant water and ozone flooded the tunnel. A terrible low-frequency groan echoed from the northern sector. It was the massive primary water vault. It had held strong against the initial quake, but the sheer dead weight of Valen's collapsing marble palace was now pressing directly onto its ancient roof. The ancient mortar, weakened by decades of aristocratic neglect, finally surrendered. A sound like a thunderclap shattered the eerie silence of the wards. The massive retaining wall burst wide open, vomiting a solid towering wall of freezing black water into the narrow The torrent carried jagged chunks of heavy masonry and splintered ironwood, transforming the flood into a churning grinder. The water surged forward with terrifying velocity, a tidal wave in a closed pipe rushing directly toward the central residential sector, and Valen was standing right in its path. He drew his broadsword, a pathetic, useless reflex against a force of nature. He was an ant facing the ocean, completely helpless as the dark water rose to The freezing black water slammed into Valen with the force of a massive battering ram. His heavy iron broadsword was instantly ripped from his grasp, swallowed without a trace by the churning tide. The violent current swept his massive frame off his feet, tossing him through the dark tunnel like broken kindling. He tumbled end over end, swallowing bitter, stagnant water, his lungs burning for oxygen. His heavy royal armor, originally designed to deflect steel blades, now acted as a lethal weight, pulling him straight toward the rocky bottom. He slammed hard into the stone walls, his ribs absorbing the brutal impacts, fighting blindly to breach the chaotic surface. He finally broke the waterline, gasping violently for air. The relentless torrent drove him further down the passage and slammed him hard against a massive iron grate blocking a central drainage junction. The rushing water pinned him there, the immense pressure crushing his chest against the rusted bars. He tried to push off, kicking his heavy boots against the iron, but he found no purchase on the slick, submerged stone. He was trapped. Directly above him, the ceiling groaned. The colossal stone archway framing the junction was shifting. The floodwaters had violently eroded its ancient mortar foundation. Thousands of pounds of solid granite began to tilt outward, leaning directly over the rushing water in his exact. The massive keystone fractured, raining a thick cloud of gray dust and small rocks onto his face. If the freezing water did not drown him, the falling archway would crush his skull into powder. A thick coil of rough hemp rope lashed across the water, striking him sharply across the shoulder. "Take the line." The voice sliced through the deafening roar of the flood. It lacked panic, it lacked fear. It was a sharp mechanical command forged in absolute certainty. Valen snapped his head up. Standing on a narrow maintenance ledge 10 feet above the raging water was Lyra. She wore a soaked canvas tunic, her boots planted wide, her heavily calloused hands gripping the other end of the heavy rope. Valen lunged, his thick fingers catching the abrasive hemp. The current immediately tightened the line, attempting to rip it from his grasp. Lyra did not waver. She threw her weight backward, locking the rope around a thick iron cleat bolted deep into the solid bedrock. The sudden tension jerked Valen out of the primary current, swinging him hard against the side wall. He groaned as his shoulder absorbed the impact, but he held his grip. "Secure it around your waist," Lyra yelled, her silver eyes completely locked on the tilting archway above him. "The keystone is failing. You have exactly 8 seconds before the structure drops." Valen looked up. The massive center block of the arch cracked wide open. He could not climb the slick vertical wall in time. He was trapped directly beneath the drop zone, entirely at the mercy of gravity. He obeyed her command, fumbling rapidly with the thick, wet rope, his numbing fingers securing a crude, tight knot around his heavy leather belt. Lyra moved with breathtaking clinical efficiency. Her mind rapidly processed the geometric angles, the immense weight of the falling stone, and the rising velocity of the water. She knew she lacked the raw physical strength to hoist a fully grown alpha warrior wearing waterlogged armor. She did not even try. Instead, she grabbed the slack of her rope, threw it over a polished ironwood crossbeam, acting as a makeshift pulley, and turned her back to the ledge. She sprinted in the opposite direction and threw her entire body weight directly off the edge of the stone platform. She dropped into the dark void. Her sudden vertical plunge acted as a flawless kinetic counterweight. The rope whipped taut over the beam. The mechanical advantage of the pulley system multiplied her dropping weight, violently yanking Valen upward and sideways. He flew completely out of the water, suspended in the cold air, just a fraction of a second before the massive granite block smashed into the exact spot he had occupied. The deafening impact shook the entire cavern, sending a massive geyser of icy water blasting upward and soaking them both. Valen hung twisting in the air, his heart hammering against his ribs. The rope held him perfectly secure. Lyra had timed the drop with mathematical precision, arresting her own fall just inches above the raging floodwaters on the other side of the tunnel. She dangled there, her arms straining against the immense tension, her chest heaving as the pulley held the balance. With a sharp grunt, she swung herself onto a sturdy lower crossbeam, anchoring her boots firmly against the stone. She released the tension lock. Valen dropped the remaining 3 feet onto a solid granite platform, safely away from the rushing flood. He collapsed onto his hands and knees, coughing up stagnant water. He lay there, shivering, his mind struggling to process the flawless physics that had just spared his life. He had expected to die a king's death, surrounded by elite guards and empty glory. Instead, he had been plucked from oblivion by a complex equation executed by the exact woman he had banished to the dirt. He forced himself to his feet. Lyra was climbing the iron rungs embedded in the wall, moving steadily toward him. Her hands were raw, the thick leather grips torn straight through by the immense friction of the heavy rope. Blood seeped into her calluses. She dropped onto the platform beside him. She did not ask if he was unhurt. She did not offer a comforting, regal touch. She immediately inspected the iron cleat on the wall, checking the structural integrity of the anchor point she had just utilized. "I was entirely wrong." Valen rasped, his throat raw from the icy water. He stepped closer, his broad frame towering over her but feeling infinitely smaller. "I looked at the polished surface and completely ignored the heavy foundation. I cast you into the dark because my fragile pride lacked the vision to see the towering light you were building." Lyra paused, her bleeding hands resting on the cold iron cleat. She finally turned, facing him. There was no petty triumph in her expression. Only the deep, heavy exhaustion of an architect who had been carrying the weight of a dying city on her shoulders for far too long. "Apologies do not reinforce load-bearing walls, Valen," she replied, stepping past him and picking up a heavy iron hammer from the platform. "We have a secondary breach developing in the lower residential sector. The hydraulic pressure is rapidly climbing. If we do not manually relieve the bottleneck at the eastern grate, the entire ward will flood in under an hour." She thrust the heavy hammer directly against his massive chest. He took it instinctively, his large calloused hand wrapping securely around the worn wooden handle. "You possess raw kinetic power," Lyra observed, looking directly into his burning silver eyes. "I possess the geometric grid. If you want to save whatever is left of your broken kingdom, you're going to help me break that eastern grate." Valen tightened his grip on the heavy iron hammer. He felt the familiar deep surge of alpha adrenaline, but this time it was not fueled by arrogance or the selfish desire for military conquest. It was fueled by an absolute terrifying devotion to the brilliant woman standing before him. He was no longer the supreme sovereign of the Solstice Spire. He was her physical instrument. "Point to the stone," Valen stated, his voice steady and resolute. The exhaustion finally claimed him. After hours of brutally swinging the heavy iron hammer against the rusted eastern grate, shattering the bottleneck and draining the deadly floodwaters, Alpha King Valen had collapsed. Now his heavy eyelids fluttered open. He was no longer lying on the freezing damp stone of the lower tunnels. He was resting on a simple canvas cot in a drafty subterranean chamber. Valen slowly pushed his battered frame upright, his muscles screaming in protest. He expected the dreary, hopeless squalor of a forgotten exile. Instead, he found himself sitting in the absolute epicenter of a towering intellectual empire. Lyra's hidden drafting room was breathtaking. It was completely devoid of the superficial gold and polished marble he had spent his life hoarding. The walls were entirely covered in massive, sprawling canvas blueprints. Intricate charcoal lines mapped the hidden anatomy of the capital, displaying a profound, beautiful understanding of civic harmony. In the center of the room stood a massive oak table bearing a staggering wooden scale model of the entire city. Valen approached the table, his breath catching in his throat. The model was not a flattering tribute to his royal vanity. It was a brutally honest diagnostic of a dying organism. Small red markers designated the failing infrastructure of the upper marble city, pinpointing the exact load-bearing columns that had violently snapped hours ago. She had known. She had perfectly mapped the exact trajectory of his arrogant downfall long before the earth ever shifted. Below the majestic surface, intricately carved ironwood braces and miniature hydraulic siphons represented her hidden work in the lower wards. He traced the tiny wooden levees with a trembling, calloused finger. This was the silent, invisible grid that had just saved thousands of lives. Every single mathematical line drawn on the canvas was a profound act of unyielding love for a people who did not even know her name. He turned toward the far corner of the room. Lyra sat bathed in the dim, flickering light of a single oil lantern. She was not resting. She was meticulously binding her raw, bleeding hands with clean linen strips, her brilliant silver eyes locked onto a fresh parchment. She looked utterly exhausted, her dark hair caked with gray stone dust, yet she radiated an absolute, terrifying sovereignty. She did not need a physical crown. Her towering mind was the true throne. Valen closed the distance between them, his heavy boots completely silent against the wooden floorboards. The primal alpha bond, which he had violently suppressed and ignored at the mating altar, now raged through his blood with agonizing clarity. He had cast away his fated mate, the true savior of the realm, replacing her towering substance with hollow aesthetic vanity. The profound, heavy weight of his unforgivable sin crushed him completely. He did not stand tall. The invincible sovereign of the Solstice Spire, a massive warrior who had never bowed to a single mortal soul, dropped heavily to both of his bare knees. The dull thud of his impact echoed loudly in the quiet chamber. Lyra paused, wrapping the linen around her palm. She did not flinch or shrink back from his massive physical presence. She simply looked down at him, her expression a clinical, unreadable calm. "My palace is a graveyard of shattered glass," Valen whispered, his deep, thunderous voice breaking raw with unshed tears. "I built a hollow monument to my own vanity, and it murdered my court. I looked at your brilliant, beautiful mind and called it filthy dirt." He reached out, his massive, trembling hands hovering just inches from her bruised fingers, terrified to actually touch her. He felt entirely, fundamentally unworthy of her sacred space. "I was a blind, arrogant fool," he choked out, bowing his head until his dark hair nearly brushed the edge of her massive drafting table. "You spent your exile bleeding in the shadows to fortify the very foundation I was actively destroying. You are the absolute master of this earth, Lyra. I am nothing but a king of useless falling stones." Lyra tied off the linen bandage, her movements deliberate and precise. She did not offer him a warm, comforting embrace. The agonizing, archaic wounds of her public humiliation were not instantly erased simply because the king finally opened his eyes. But she also did not strike him. She saw a massive kinetic instrument finally realizing its proper place within the massive structural grid. "Tears do not stop the rising tide," Valen Lyra replied, her voice steady, carrying the quiet, undeniable authority of the true architect. "Your pristine marble walls have fallen. The fragile illusion of your absolute supremacy is permanently dead. The heavy earth has aggressively reclaimed the balance." Valen raised his head, his silver eyes burning with a desperate, absolute devotion. "Then let me be your heavy iron," he pleaded, baring his soul with terrifying raw vulnerability. "Strip my royal titles. Melt my broken golden crown. I entirely surrender my absolute authority to your geometric grid. Point to the stone and I will strike it. Tell me where to stand, and I will manually hold the ceiling until my spine snaps. Just let me serve the towering, brilliant light of your mind." Lyra studied his desperate, kneeling form. The arrogant, elitist tyrant was completely gone, perfectly replaced by a raw, unyielding, kinetic anchor, ready to bear the immense heavy weight of her new world. She slowly reached out her bandaged fingers, gently touching the heavy, scarred line of his jaw. "The earth is momentarily stable," Lyra stated, her gaze hardening into a terrifying, clinical resolve. "But the dark, freezing water is not our greatest enemy anymore. Your surviving noble council has retreated to the upper eastern plateau, and they control the primary floodgates. If they realize the lower wards are still actively standing, they will actively choose to drown us all simply to save their hoarded luxury estates. Valen rose from his knees, moving with a quiet, lethal grace that belied his towering physical bulk. He did not attempt to reclaim his shattered regal authority or issue hollow commands. He simply stepped to the opposite side of her massive oak drafting table, waiting in absolute silence for her brilliant mind to dictate their next move. Lyra unrolled a thick canvas map of the eastern plateau, the coarse parchment resisting her bandaged fingers. Instantly, Valen's large calloused hands reached across the table. He did not snatch the map or assume control. He gently pressed his thick fingers against the curling corners, smoothing the rough canvas flat against the wood and placing iron weights to secure her vision. Lyra watched his meticulous, careful movements. The invincible Alpha King was entirely submitting his raw physical strength to serve her geometric grid. Her analytical mind had spent years calculating the exact compressive load of failing mortar, but mapping the profound emotional shift in the man standing before her was an entirely different complex equation. The primal biological bond humming beneath her skin, previously a source of agonizing humiliation, now sparked with a warm, steady current. He was no longer the arrogant tyrant who had demanded aesthetic perfection. He was a battered, exhausted warrior offering himself as the foundational bedrock for her new world. The corrupt council controls the upper aqueduct gates. Lyra explained, her voice steady, tracing a long charcoal line indicating the primary eastern reservoir. You're listening to this story on the Alpha King Secrets channel. Are you enjoying today's story? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Now, let's get back to the story. If they open the secondary spillways, they will intentionally divert the rising floodwaters away from their luxury estates directly into our lower ventilation shafts. It would completely bypass our reinforced levees and drown. Because Valen leaned heavily over the table, his broad bare chest casting long shadows in the flickering lantern light. The sheer physical heat radiating from his muscular frame wrapped around her, a comforting heavy blanket in the draft. How do we permanently sever their control? He asked, his silver eyes locked entirely onto her intricate mathematical lines. We cannot simply smash the upper iron gears, Lyra replied, shaking her head. The kinetic recoil would shatter the entire retaining wall. We must actively counter the hydraulic pressure from below. I need to construct a manual pressure lock in the central junction, but it requires lifting a solid ironwood bulkhead into place against a rushing current. It is mathematically possible, but it requires a staggering amount of raw physical torque. Valen did not hesitate. He looked up from the sprawling canvas, his intense gaze locking directly onto her pale silver eyes. Point to the junction, Lyra. Give me the ironwood and tell me exactly when to heave. I will hold the rushing tide with my bare hands until your equation is perfectly complete. The absolute certainty in his deep, thunderous voice sent a thrilling shiver down her spine. This was the true slow burn of an earned, undeniable alliance. It was not built on fragile romantic poetry or shallow aesthetic displays. It was forged in the freezing mud, heavily anchored by mutual survival and cemented by his absolute reverence for her towering intellect. Lyra reached across the rough canvas, her bandaged fingers gently brushing against his calloused knuckles. The physical contact was brief, but the intense electric jolt of their awakened mate bond flared, illuminating the dark chamber brighter than any oil lamp. Valen released a deep rumbling alpha purr, entirely involuntary, a raw primal sound of devotion vibrating in his chest. He turned his scarred hand, slowly trapping her small fingers beneath his warm, heavy palm. He did not pull her forcefully into his arms. He simply held her hand against the master blueprint, treating her brilliant mind and her fragile body with the exact same sacred reverence. We will build a pressure lock together, Valen murmured, his voice a soft melodic anchor in the claustrophobic dark. And when the floodwaters are permanently tamed, we will march directly up to the eastern plateau. I will make the corrupt lords look you perfectly in the eyes before I dismantle their useless hierarchy. Lyra felt a deep restorative warmth bloom inside her exhausted chest. The traumatized 10-year-old girl who had desperately tried to hold up a collapsing ceiling was finally entirely safe. She had found the ultimate kinetic engine to power her architectural revolution. She squeezed his warm, heavy hand, accepting the terrifying Alpha as her absolute equal partner in the dark. But the quiet, intimate sanctuary of their forged alliance was abruptly shattered. A massive iron bell hung near the upper tunnel entrance began to ring with a frantic urgency. The deep metallic clangs echoed through the subterranean chamber, destroying the peaceful silence. Lyra tore her gaze away from Valen, looking sharply toward the dark corridor. The acoustic vibration of the ringing bell meant only one terrifying thing. The corrupt noble council was not waiting for the morning light. They were prematurely opening the upper floodgates right now, intentionally sending a catastrophic wall of dark freezing water directly down into her vulnerable grid. The final brutal battle for the absolute survival of the lower wards had officially begun, and their stolen time was entirely gone. The frantic ringing of the heavy iron bell dictated a brutal ticking clock. Lyra and Valen sprinted through the claustrophobic passageways, plunging deeper into the dark subterranean labyrinth. The air in the lower junction was sweltering, heated by massive geothermal vents, expelling excess steam from the failing upper city. Thick humidity clung to their skin, making every desperate breath feel like inhaling damp wool. Lyra navigated the treacherous footing with flawless precision, her mind racing far ahead of her physical body. She mentally calculated the exact velocity of the diverted floodwaters currently rushing down the primary eastern spill. They possessed exactly 15 short minutes to manually secure the massive ironwood bulkhead before the central residential grid. They burst into the staging cavern. The colossal ironwood barrier rested on rusted iron tracks ready to be hoisted into the main arterial tunnel. Thick chains hung from the towering ceiling pulleys. Lyra immediately lunged for the primary hoist chain, grabbing the abrasive metal. Her crude linen bandages, hastily tied in the quiet drafting room, instantly surrendered to the immense friction. The heavy iron links tore at her raw palms, ripping open her fresh blisters. Bright red blood rapidly seeped down the dark chain, but she stubbornly refused to let go, her jaw clamped tight in unyielding defiance. Valen closed the distance in a single massive stride. He did not issue a sharp command or pull her forcefully. He simply placed his large, calloused hands directly over hers, enveloping her bleeding, trembling fingers. His physical touch was incredibly gentle, a staggering contrast to his terrifying military. "Release the heavy iron, Lyra," he murmured, his deep, thunderous voice vibrating through the sweltering, humid air, cutting through the distant rumble of the approaching water. "Your mind engineered this absolute miracle. You do not need to shatter your own fragile bones to execute it." He carefully pried the rough chain from her fierce grasp. Lyra stood shivering slightly despite the oppressive subterranean heat, watching the invincible Alpha King drop heavily to one knee directly before her. He retrieved a clean spool of thick medical linen from his utility belt. He took her small, trembling hand, resting it gently upon his broad, scarred palm. The primal biological bond flared between them, wrapping them in a heavy blanket of pure, raw devotion. It was not a chaotic feral lust. It was the profound, slow-burning chemistry of absolute mutual respect. He began to wrap her bruised hands, his movements breathtakingly precise and overwhelmingly tender. "I spent my entire brutal reign demanding the massive world completely kneel to my raw physical power," Valen confessed, keeping his intense silver eyes locked solely on her bleeding skin. "I truly thought a supreme sovereign was forged in shattered swords and conquered territories. I believed ruling meant standing on the highest pristine marble tower, insulated from the heavy dirt." He secured the fresh linen securely around her wrist, binding it tight enough to support her exhausted muscles but gentle enough to spare her any unnecessary pain. "But true power is exactly this." Valen continued, his voice thick with heavy unshed emotion. "True absolute power is building a heavy foundation so strong it can carry the entire failing world in the dark. It is bleeding in the toxic shadows simply to ensure a forgotten child can breathe." I was entirely blind. He lifted her freshly bandaged hand, slowly pressing his warm lips directly against the rough linen covering her palm. It was an act of profound religious worship. A heavy, undeniable vow of eternal servitude. "I worship the towering genius of your mind," he vowed, his breath hot against her damp skin. "I absolutely worship the dark dirt permanently staining your hands and the architectural grid you carry within your beautiful soul. I will manually hold the crushing weight of the earth for you until the end of time." Lyra stared down at the massive kneeling warrior, her heart hammering against her ribs. The dark, traumatic ice that had permanently frozen her chest for 15 brutal years melted under the radiant, kinetic heat of his absolute devotion. She reached down with her free hand, sliding her bandaged fingers deep into his dark hair, gently pulling him up. Valen rose, his massive frame towering perfectly over her, his broad chest rising and falling heavily. He did not push for a shallow physical conquest. He simply leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling completely in the sweltering dark. "I accept your heavy iron," Valen, Lyra whispered, closing her pale silver eyes, anchoring her brilliant intellect to his raw kinetic strength. "We break the archaic, aristocratic world entirely today." A massive, deafening tremor shook the deep staging cavern, vibrating the heavy iron tracks beneath their boots. The quiet, intimate sanctuary shattered, instantly replaced by the terrifying raw physics of the earth. The floodwater was rapidly accelerating down the eastern shaft. Valen turned sharply toward the massive hoist chain, his heavy muscles visibly expanding as he prepared to haul the colossal ironwood bulkhead into the designated drop position. But as his callous hands gripped the rusted metal, a sharp metallic clatter echoed from the upper ventilation grate. overlooking their hidden position. Lyra snapped her head upward, her analytical mind instantly recognizing the precise acoustic anomaly. It was not crumbling stone or rushing water. It was the distinct mechanical click of loaded crossbows. Through the thick, swirling steam, she saw the menacing dark silhouettes of elite royal mercenaries actively descending the heavy iron ladders. The corrupt noble council had not simply opened the upper floodgates. They had dispatched heavily armed assassins deep into the lower grid to actively guarantee the absolute destruction of the slums. The heavy leather boots of the elite royal mercenaries struck the damp stone floor of the staging cavern, echoing with a terrifying rhythmic precision. 6 heavily armored assassins fanned out across the lower platform, raising their loaded iron crossbows directly toward the massive hoist chain. Lyra stood perfectly still, her brilliant mind rapidly calculating the lethal geometry of the ambush. She traced the projected trajectory of their heavy iron bolts, instantly realizing they were not aiming for her fragile chest. They were aiming directly at the rusted central locking gear of the hoist mechanism. If they shattered that fragile iron pinion, the colossal ironwood bulkhead would violently crash down prematurely, permanently jamming the tracks and guaranteeing the absolute catastrophic flooding of the entire lower grid. The lead mercenary stepped forward into the dim, flickering lantern light. It was Commander Thorn, the highly decorated captain of the aristocratic vanguard. He wore the pristine silver crest of the High Noble Council upon his heavy breastplate, entirely devoid of the royal insignia representing the king. He looked at the massive alpha warrior standing defensively before the chain, his eyes widening slightly in brief surprise before hardening into absolute cold indifference. King Valen, Commander Thorn projected his voice, echoing sharply against the sweltering stone, completely lacking any traditional regal deference. The High Noble Council assumed you perished in the upper marble collapse. Lord Sterling has officially assumed absolute emergency authority over the surviving capital. You're formally ordered to stand down and immediately return to the Eastern Plateau. Valen did not move a single muscle, his massive frame remaining perfectly locked between the loaded crossbows and Lyra. He felt a profound, terrifying rage aggressively boiling within his heavy alpha blood. The absolute staggering depth of the aristocratic rot was finally laid bare before him. You actively intend to drown the lower wards, Valen growled, his deep, thunderous voice carrying a lethal kinetic promise. You're intentionally diverting the primary reservoir directly into the central residential grid. Thousands of innocent citizens are trapped in these tunnels, Thorn. The innocent citizens of the slums are an acceptable structural buffer. Thorn countered, his tone chillingly practical and utterly devoid of basic human empathy. The upper Eastern Plateau is completely overwhelmed by the rising water. The luxury estates of the Noble Council. By manually rerouting the immense hydraulic pressure into these lower ventilation shafts, we can safely drain the aristocratic sectors. The High Lords categorically refuse to evacuate their ancient manors simply to spare a subterranean graveyard. The slums must drown, so the pristine marble city can survive. Lyra listened to the horrific political decree, her pale silver eyes narrowing with an absolute icy resolve. She was not shocked by the profound moral bankruptcy of the elite council. She had spent her entire life actively observing the deep systemic rot infecting the upper capital. The heavy stone foundations of the city were not the only things crumbling under immense pressure. The entire corrupt hierarchy was a lethal disease, aggressively, actively murdering the fragile, vulnerable lower class to preserve their empty hoard. To them, the impoverished masses were merely disposable sandbags meant to passively absorb the violent, chaotic wrath of the earth. Valen tightened his massive fists, his scarred knuckles popping loudly in the sweltering dark. I am the absolute sovereign of this realm, Valen roared, his terrifying alpha presence violently expanding to fill the cavern. I categorically revoke the emergency authority of the High Council. You will immediately lower your weapons and assist this master architect in securing the heavy ironwood bulkhead. Thorn did not lower his heavy crossbow. He sneered, his lips curling into a mask of arrogant aristocratic disdain. You're a king of a fallen, ruined palace, Valen. The ancient laws of absolute monarchical supremacy are completely dead. The Noble Council controls the remaining gold, the royal military, and the upper floodgates. This filthy, dirt-stained Omega is attempting to block the primary drainage route, and we are here to actively ensure her pathetic architectural grid violently fails. Lyra stepped out from behind the massive protective bulk of the Alpha King, entirely refusing to hide in his heavy shadow. She stood perfectly equal beside him, her raw bandaged hands resting lightly against the cold rusted iron of the hoist chain. She did not possess raw military strength, but she held the absolute supreme power of the earth in her brilliant mind. You cannot execute a geometric impossibility, Commander Thorn. Lyra projected her melodic voice, cutting flawlessly through the humid, sweltering tension. The massive kinetic force of the incoming floodwater is already aggressively accelerating down the main eastern shaft. If you shatter this central locking gear, the hydraulic back pressure will violently rebound directly up the primary aqueduct. You will not save your precious luxury estates. You will actively trigger a catastrophic subterranean geyser that will entirely violently obliterate the eastern plateau from below. Thorn hesitated, his eyes darting nervously toward the dark, trembling tunnel. The deep, terrifying acoustic roar of the approaching tidal wave was rapidly growing louder, aggressively shaking the loose stones from the cavern ceiling. He did not possess the towering architectural intellect to verify her terrifying mathematical calculation, but the absolute, unyielding certainty in her pale silver eyes shook his arrogant resolve. "Do not listen to her desperate lies," Thorn commanded his men, his voice cracking slightly under the immense atmospheric pressure. "Shatter the hoist gear now." The heavy iron crossbows violently snapped upward. Valen unleashed a deafening, thunderous roar, violently lunging forward to physically intercept the lethal barrage. The deafening mechanical snap of the heavy bowstrings echoed simultaneously with the terrifying, explosive roar of the dark, freezing water, violently breaching the adjacent tunnel, completely plunging the subterranean cavern into absolute kinetic chaos. Boots struck the damp limestone. 6 armored assassins dropped from the upper ventilation shaft, splashing into the shallow runoff, pooling on the staging platform. They fanned out in perfect military formation, raising loaded crossbows. Lyra did not shrink behind Valen. Her mind instantly traced the sight lines of their weapons. The iron quarrels did not point toward Valen's chest or her own. They aimed precisely at the rusted central pinion of the hoist mechanism. If that single gear shattered, the colossal ironwood bulkhead would plummet off its tracks, leaving the residential grid completely exposed to the approaching flood. Commander Thorn stepped into the flickering lantern light. He wore the silver crest of the High Noble Council upon his breastplate, the royal insignia, the mark of the king he was sworn to protect, had been meticulously filed off. "King Valen," Thorn said. His voice carried no deference. "The High Council assumed you perished in the upper collapse. Lord Sterling has invoked emergency authority over the surviving capital. You're ordered to stand down and return to the eastern plateau immediately." Valen did not shift his stance. He remained planted between the loaded weapons and Lyra's machinery. The heat radiating from his skin felt like a furnace in the damp chill. "You intend to drown the lower wards," he said, his voice a low, rumbling threat. "You're diverting the primary reservoir into these tunnels. Thousands of people are sleeping behind us." Thorn kept his crossbow leveled. "The slum residents are an acceptable buffer. The upper eastern plateau is flooding. The luxury estates are sinking. By routing the hydraulic pressure down here, we drain the aristocratic sectors. The High Lords will not evacuate their manors to spare a subterranean graveyard. The dirt must wash away so the marble can stand." Lyra listened to the cold calculation. This was the disease she had fought her entire life. To the nobility, the lives of the poor were nothing but sandbags. They would gladly drown an entire generation to keep their silk carpets dry. She stepped forward, her bandaged hands resting lightly on the cold iron of the hoist lever. She looked Thorn dead in the eyes. "You cannot execute a geometric impossibility," she stated. Her voice cut through the cavern, steady and melodic against the rising roar of the distant water. "The incoming floodwater is already accelerating down the main shaft. If you shatter this gear, the bulkhead falls, but the hydraulic back pressure will rebound straight up the primary aqueduct. You will not drain your precious estates. You will trigger a geyser that obliterates the eastern plateau from below." Thorn blinked. His eyes darted toward the dark tunnel, listening to the approaching thunder of the river. He lacked the intellect to verify her math, but the absolute certainty in her gaze rattled his confidence. He recovered quickly, sneering behind his visor. "Do not listen to the Omega. Shatter the gear." The crossbow snapped. Valen exploded into motion. He snatched a discarded oak plank from the floor, swinging it upward in a blur. He intercepted the volley mid-air. Iron bolts slammed deep into the wood, embedding themselves mere inches from his hands. He tossed the ruined plank aside and plunged directly into the line of mercenaries. He had no broadsword. He wore no armor, but his body was forged in decades of brutal combat. He collided with Thorn, grabbing the commander by his breastplate and driving him backward into the cavern wall. The stone cracked. Thorn slumped, his silver crest crumpled inward. Valen spun, catching the next assassin by the throat and hurling him across the platform. He did not fight with the poised arrogance of a king defending a crown. He fought with the desperate, visceral fury of a man protecting his mate's found. Every punch he threw dismantled the corrupt hierarchy he had once blindly commanded. Lyra tuned out the violence. The cavern vibrated. The water breached the upper tunnel walls, vomiting streams of high-pressure runoff onto the floor. She threw her weight against the manual lever, her raw palms screaming as she fought to maintain the tension on the hoist. The mathematics of the room were shifting. The track groaned under the changing tectonic loads. Two mercenaries realized they could not best the Alpha King in a melee. They broke away from the skirmish, splashing toward the load-bearing ironwood column that supported the cavern ceiling and the hoist track. They drew heavy steel maces. They intended to collapse the roof directly onto the machine. "Hold the gear, Lyra," Valen shouted. He kicked an assassin's knee, snapping the joint, and lunged toward the saboteurs. He caught the first man, burying his fist into the mercenary's ribs and tossing him into the rising water. But the cavern was sweltering, the shadows thick with steam. The last assassin slipped around the pillar, raising his spiked mace high above his head. Lyra watched the arc of the weapon. Her mind calculated the impact geometry in a fraction of a second. He was aiming for the primary diagonal crossbeam. If that timber fractured, the entire hoist mechanism would tear free from the bedrock. "Valen," she cried out. The steel mace struck the wood. A sickening percussive crack echoed over the roar of the flood. Valen tackled the mercenary, dragging him beneath the black water, but the kinetic transfer had already occurred. Lyra stared up at the crossbeam. A jagged fault line raced across the dense grain of the wood. The weight of the colossal ironwood bulkhead, magnified by gravity and the shifting earth, tore the weakened support apart. The timber splintered. The rusted iron pinion above Lyra's head shrieked. The manual lever jerked upward, ripping itself from her bleeding hands and throwing her backward onto the wet stone. The track buckled. Screws shot from the bedrock like bullets. Valen dragged himself out of the water chest, heaving just in time to watch the ceiling support snap completely in half. Thousands of pounds of dead weight shifted. The iron gear exploded. The colossal ironwood bulkhead derailed, sliding backward and crashing uselessly against the sidewall. The tunnel was wide open, and the dark freezing flood surged around the final bend, ready to swallow their world. The ironwood bulkhead lay shattered against the cavern wall. The primary lock was dead. The acoustic roar of the incoming flood shifted from a distant rumble to a deafening physical vibration, shaking the marrow in Lyra's bones. The black water surged around the final bend, a churning wall of liquid destruction, ready to consume the lower wards. Because Lyra did not scream, she did not freeze. The rigid physical barrier had failed. Her shield was gone. But her mind remained an untouchable fortress of structural logic. If she could not block the kinetic force, she had to rewrite the geometric rules of the earth. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. The intricate blueprint of the subterranean grid burned vividly in her mind, a living, breathing map of limestone, mortar, iron, and gravity. She traced the fault lines of the cavern. The approaching flood was pure raw energy. Energy cannot be stopped by a broken gate, but it can be redirected. She just needed the perfect pivot point. "Valen?" Her voice sliced clean through the rising chaos. He was instantly at her side, stagnant water pouring from his broad shoulders. He wiped mercenary blood from his bruised jaw and looked down at her. He asked no questions. He demanded no retreat. The Alpha King simply waited for his mate to build the path. "The track is destroyed," Lyra stated, stepping away from the ruined hoist. "We cannot block the river. We must steer it." "Where?" Valen asked. "Upward." He stared at her. "Water does not climb, Lyra." "It does, if I build a pressure cannon," she replied, wading through the rapidly rising pool toward a heavy wooden crate of scavenged mining explosives abandoned near the tunnel entrance. The eastern reservoir is dumping millions of gallons into a tight bottleneck. The hydraulic pressure is compounding exponentially. If we blow the central ceiling grate, the water will seek the path of least resistance. It will shoot straight up through the aristocratic drainage system. We will flush the flood directly back into the marble estates. A fierce predatory grin spread across Valen's bruised face. "We turn their own blade against them." "Yes, but it requires flawless demolition," Lyra said, tossing him a heavy canvas satchel of black powder. "We have to shatter 3 specific load-bearing columns simultaneously. It will create a vacuum chute. The back pressure will suck the floodwater upward before it breaches the residential grid. But we are standing in the blast zone." She pointed to 3 colossal granite pillars supporting the upper vault. "Set the charges exactly at the structural fault lines," she instructed, grabbing a piece of broken chalk. She splashed toward the nearest pillar, marking a precise white cross on the wet stone. 4 feet from the base. Angle the blast upward. If we miss the calculation by a single inch, we bring the entire mountain down on our heads. Valen grabbed the satchel. He moved with lethal precision. He was no longer a king sitting on a hollow throne. He was the ultimate kinetic engine executing her towering intellect. He scaled the rough stone of the first pillar, wedging the explosive charges deep into the fissures she had marked. He dropped into the knee-deep water, waded to the second pillar, and secured the next bundle. His massive muscles flexed under the immense strain, operating with absolute blind faith in her mathematical vision. He did not question the geometry. He trusted her mind implicitly. Lyra wired the detonation lines, her bleeding hands moving with mechanical speed. The water was waist-deep now, freezing cold and actively pulling at her legs. The roar of the main tidal wave crested just down the corridor, a deafening drumbeat of impending doom. She stripped the protective casing from the copper wires, twisting them securely into the rusted iron detonator box. Every twist of the wire was a sacred vow to the forgotten people sleeping in the tenements behind her. They would not drown in the dark today. The elite architects had ignored the lower depths, but she would force them to reap the harvest of their own neglect. "Lines are set," Valen shouted, splashing through the churning water to reach her side. Lyra gripped the iron plunger. The primal bond between them hummed a current of pure, unbreakable trust. This was their true mating ritual. It was not a shallow ceremony dressed in silk and golden banners staged for a corrupt audience. It was a high-stakes engineering miracle forged in the freezing mud. They were binding their lives together over a single spark of raw combustion in the shadow of complete annihilation. She looked up into his silver eyes. The water swirled violently around their chests, pulling them toward the drain. The acoustics of the cavern changed sharply, signaling the final breach. The flood was here. "If my math is wrong, the ceiling crushes us," Lyra said. Valen wrapped his calloused hand over hers, covering her bleeding fingers on the detonator handle. He leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers. His heat chased the freezing chill from her bones. "Then we hold the mountain together in the dark," he answered, his voice a steady anchor against the roaring tide. "I trust your grid." The main tunnel exploded. The tidal wave crested the final bend, a towering wall of churning black liquid rushing straight for them, ready to consume the lower wards. "Now," Lyra commanded. Together, they slammed the iron plunger down. The spark traveled down the stripped copper wire faster than a human heartbeat. The three colossal granite pillars detonated with mathematical synchronicity. A blinding flash of kinetic energy illuminated the sweltering cavern, instantly followed by a concussive shockwave that erased the deafening roar of the incoming tidal wave. The stone columns shattered into calculated geometric fragments, collapsing the upper vault exactly along the fault lines Lyra had meticulously drawn. The cavern ceiling opened, revealing the vertical drainage shaft leading directly up to the eastern plateau. The atmospheric pressure within the enclosed tunnel instantly inverted, creating a terrifying subterranean vacuum. The churning black tidal wave slammed into the blast zone. It carried millions of gallons of freezing water, driven by a crushing hydraulic force ready to obliterate the fragile lower tenements. But water operates on the undeniable laws of physics, always seeking the path of least resistance. Instead of surging forward into the residential grid, the aquatic battering ram hit the newly forged vertical void. The immense hydraulic back pressure seized the flood, rocketing the dark liquid straight upward into the shattered ceiling grate. It was a flawless pressure cannon. The entire subterranean river changed its deadly trajectory, acting entirely upon the architectural command of a single brilliant mind. Lyra and Valen were thrown backward against the rough cavern wall by the sheer atmospheric displacement. The Alpha King shielded her with his muscular frame, anchoring them both against the bedrock as the aquatic apocalypse flew over their heads. The kinetic roar was absolute, plunging them into a deafening vortex of wind and freezing water droplets. The entire cavern vibrated as if the earth itself was screaming, but the solid stone floor beneath their boots remained steady. The deep ironwood braces and the thick fortified levees she had secretly built held the surrounding earth intact. The foundation of tomorrow refused. Far above them on the pristine eastern plateau, the corrupt noble council stood upon their polished marble balconies. They smugly waited for the lower depths to silently drown, expecting their luxury estates to drain safely into the hidden dark beneath the city. Lord Sterling raised a crystal goblet of wine, toasting to their brutal survival. Instead, the ancient ornate iron grates dotting their immaculate courtyards exploded. The freezing black subterranean water blasted upward like a volcanic eruption. A towering geyser of dark liquid completely overwhelmed the manicured lawns, drowning the pristine gardens and the hoarded aristocratic wealth. The heavy wrought iron gates of the elite district shattered under the redirected tide. The deep systemic rot of the upper hierarchy was ruthlessly washed away by the exact element they had weaponized against the invisible poor. Back in the deep staging cavern, the terrifying roar slowly faded into a hollow dripping echo. The violent atmospheric displacement finally settled, leaving the air thick with the smell of ozone and wet stone. The pool of stagnant water covering the cavern floor rapidly drained away, actively sucked dry by the vertical vacuum. The immediate structural threat to the slums was entirely neutralized. Lyra slowly opened her silver eyes. She looked past the broad shoulder of the Alpha King, peering down the dark corridor leading toward the central residential grid. The lower tunnels were completely quiet, untouched by the devastating flood. Her geometric grid had survived the wrath of the shifting earth. Thousands of impoverished citizens were sleeping peacefully, unaware that a rejected Omega architect had just rewritten the fundamental laws of nature to guarantee their fragile existence. Valen released his protective grip, stepping back to look at the empty tunnel. He tilted his head upward, staring directly into the vertical shaft where the raging river had disappeared. The staggering scale of her intellect completely immobilized him. He slowly turned his intense gaze back to Lyra. She stood amidst the ruined staging cavern, her canvas tunic soaked, her dark hair caked with gray stone dust and explosive powder. Yet to Valen she burned brighter than any polished golden crown. She had not simply saved the vulnerable city. She had inverted the oppressive hierarchy of power, utilizing nothing but pure, flawless mathematics. "We hold the mountain," he whispered, his deep voice vibrating with reverent awe as he traced the unbroken line of her jaw with his calloused thumb. Lyra pushed herself fully upright, shaking the damp chill from her exhausted bones. The brutal physical battle against the chaotic elements of the earth was finished. But the final structural alignment of her new world was only just beginning. She looked up at the shattered vertical shaft, her eyes hardening into cold resolve. "The earth has yielded to reason," Lyra stated, her voice echoing with sovereign authority through the quiet dark. "Now we must force the surviving elite to do exactly the same." We marched to the surface, Valen. The climb out of the deep subterranean grid tested their exhausted muscles. Lyra led the ascent, hauling herself up the cold iron rungs of the secondary ventilation shaft. Her raw palms bled through the fresh linen bandages, but she did not stop. The vertical tunnels smelled of ozone and wet earth, a sharp, clean contrast to the stagnant decay that normally choked the slums. Valen climbed directly beneath her, his broad shoulders serving as a physical safety net. He did not rush her pace or bark hollow encouragement. He simply maintained the rear guard, ensuring her steady, unyielding progression toward the surface. They reached the summit. Valen pressed his hands against the heavy iron grate blocking the exit. He braced his leather boots against the slick masonry and shoved upward. The rusted hinges shrieked before snapping. He tossed the iron aside, letting it clang against the paving stones, and pulled himself onto the eastern plateau. He reached down, gripping Lyra's forearm, and hoisted her out of the dark. The eastern plateau, once the absolute zenith of the royal capital, was unrecognizable. The pristine marble courtyards were gone. The manicured gardens and exotic hedgerows had been obliterated by the reverse hydraulic geyser. A thick layer of black subterranean mud covered the immaculate cobblestones. Ruined silk banners floated in pools of dirty water. The luxury manors built upon superficial aesthetic foundations leaned precariously. Their white stone facades cracked, weeping silt into the streets. The destructive force the nobility had weaponized against the poor had returned to claim its origin. Dozens of elite nobles huddled in the ruined central square. They shivered in the cold morning air, their expensive velvet robes soaked in mud. The arrogant courtiers who had openly mocked Lyra at the grand mating altar now wept over shattered porcelain and ruined finery. They wandered like aimless ghosts through the sprawling graveyard of their own vanity. At the center of the courtyard stood Lord Sterling. The head of the High Noble Council clutched a gold-headed cane, barking frantic orders at a small contingent of royal guards. His silver hair was plastered to his skull with dark dirt. "Clear the central pavilion," Sterling shouted, striking a guard in the chest with his cane. "Establish a perimeter around the treasury vault. We must salvage the royal gold reserves before the lower class realizes the perimeter is breached." The guards hesitated. Their armor was dented, their morale entirely shattered by the wrath of the earth. They looked exhausted and lacking in direction, staring blankly at the mud. "Do your duty," Sterling commanded, his voice cracking. "The king is dead." The lower words are drowned. "I am the supreme authority of this capital. You are a squatter standing on a fractured foundation." Valen's deep voice carried across the ruined courtyard. It did not echo with the artificial amplification of a throne room. It struck the morning air with raw, undeniable gravity. The entire square froze. The weeping nobles turned their heads. Lord Sterling dropped his cane, the gold head clattering against a broken paving stone. Valen stepped forward into the gray light of dawn. He wore no crown. He carried no sword. His bare chest was covered in bruises and dried blood. Yet he projected a terrifying sovereignty that no royal mandate could grant. Beside him walked Lyra. She did not trail in his shadow. She stepped in perfect tandem, her chin raised, her silver eyes locked onto the corrupt council leader. She wore the grime of the lower tunnels like war paint. King Valen Sterling stammered, taking a step backward. His face drained of color. "We thought the palace collapsed. The report stated you were crushed." Valen closed the distance. The royal guards parted instantly, lowering their iron spears in absolute submission. They did not bow to an empty title. They bowed to the raw kinetic force radiating from the Alpha Warrior. "Your reports were wrong," Valen stated. "And your flood failed." Sterling swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the open iron grate they had just emerged from. "Impossible. We opened the upper floodgates. The entire reservoir diverted into the eastern shafts. The lower grade cannot hold that hydrostatic pressure." "It cannot hold if built by fools," Lyra interjected. She stepped past Valen, stopping a few feet from the council leader. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to shout to establish absolute command. "You tried to use the earth as a weapon, Sterling. You dumped millions of gallons of water into a confined space, hoping to crush the vulnerable. But you failed to calculate the hydraulic back pressure. I shattered your drainage bottleneck. The kinetic force sought the path of least resistance. It climbed straight up your ventilation shafts. You drowned your own estates." Sterling stared at her, his aristocratic pride struggling against the undeniable reality of the mud covering his boots. "You are the exiled Omega. The contractor." "I am the master architect," Lyra replied flatly. "And your marble city is dead." Sterling sneered, regaining a fraction of his venom. "You think you have won because you redirected a river? You stand in the ruins of the empire. The palace is gone. The treasury is buried. We have no infrastructure. The kingdom will dissolve into anarchy before nightfall." Valen stepped up beside Lyra. He looked out over the shivering elite, the broken statues, and the sinking manors. He felt no grief for the lost wealth. "The empire you built deserved to fall." Valen said, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "It was a hollow shell resting on the backs of the invisible. You sat on a throne of gold and ignored the rotting timber beneath your feet. But the kingdom will not dissolve." He turned his head, looking down at Lyra. His silver eyes burned with fierce public devotion. "Because the foundation holds," Valen declared. "The lower wards survived the tectonic shock. The deep aqueducts are reinforced. The structural grid is flawless. My fated mate did not just save the people you tried to murder. She built the bedrock of a new world." He turned back to Sterling and the trembling council. "Your authority is permanently revoked," Valen commanded. "There will be no more High Council. There will be no more disposable citizens. Every surviving noble will pick up a shovel. You will dig the mud from these streets. You will carry stone. You will learn the profound language of the earth. And you will take your orders directly from her." He pointed to Lyra. "The era of aesthetic vanity is over," Valen finished. "The era of the grid begins now." The iron doors of the royal armory swung open. Valen did not distribute swords or halberds. He hauled wooden crates of scavenged mining tools into the morning light. He dropped a bundle of rusted shovels and iron pickaxes directly at the feet of the shivering noble council. The metal clattered loudly against the mud-covered cobblestones. "Pick them up," Valen ordered. Lord Sterling stared at the wooden handles as if they were venomous serpents. He crossed his arms over his ruined velvet robes. "I'm a High Lord of the Eastern Plateau. I do not dig." Valen did not yell. He did not draw a blade. He simply stepped forward, grabbed a shovel, and thrust it deep into the thick black mud burying the courtyard drain. He leveraged his weight, lifted a solid block of debris, and tossed it aside. "You're a survivor," Valen corrected, leaning on the wooden shaft. "And survivors work. Pick up the iron, Sterling, or leave the capital. The wild borderlands do not care about your titles. You will starve out there by nightfall." Sterling looked at the desolate, ruined perimeter of the city, then back to the mud. Slowly, his shaking hands reached down and grasped the rough wood of a shovel. The other nobles followed suit. The delicate aristocrats, whose greatest physical exertion had been lifting crystal wine goblets, drove their tools into the muck. Lyra ignored the pathetic display. She commanded a squad of former royal guards to drag a wide unbroken slab of white marble into the center of the square. She spread her thick canvas blueprints across the stone, weighing the corners down with broken masonry. She did not hide in a subterranean draft room anymore. Her geometric grid belonged in the open air. The citizens of the lower wards began to emerge from the depths. They climbed up the ventilation shafts and the stabilized access ramps, blinking against the harsh morning sun. They carried their own meager tools, hammers, wedges, lengths of woven rope. They expected to find an execution squad or a flooded tomb. Instead, they found their exiled architects standing at the center of the world, charting the future while the High Lords dug trenches in the dirt. A profound silence washed over the crowd. Then an older man with a scarred face stepped forward. He was a tunnel foreman Lyra, recognized from the western sector. He walked past the struggling nobles, picked up a stray pickaxe, and looked directly at Lyra. "Where do we strike, Master Architect?" he asked. Lyra looked up from her canvas. She saw thousands of eyes fixed on her, waiting for the logic that would rebuild their lives. These were the invisible people. The discarded foundation. Now they were the only ones capable of saving the capital. "We secure the eastern retaining wall," Lyra commanded, her voice ringing clear across the square. "The mud is pooling against the fractured limestone. If we do not relieve the lateral pressure, the foundation will slide into the gorge. Form 3 lines. Clear the debris away from the load-bearing pillars." The crowd moved. They operated with a unified, silent efficiency forged in the dark. They understood the stakes. Valen joined the first line. He stripped his ruined royal armor, casting the useless metal into the mud. He worked shoulder to shoulder with the commoners. When a fractured column of marble threatened to crush a group of workers, Valen stepped in. He braced his back against the stone, his muscles trembling under the immense strain, holding the dead weight long enough for the citizens to drive iron wedges beneath it. He sweat in the sun, his skin mixing with the dust of the ruined city. He earned their loyalty with every swing of the hammer. He led not by royal decree, but by pure kinetic output. By midday, the lateral pressure against the eastern wall dropped to a safe metric. The immediate threat of a secondary landslide vanished. Lyra stood over her makeshift drafting table, charcoal staining her fingertips. She recalibrated the load vectors, drafting a new aqueduct path that would serve both the plateau and the lower grid equally. A shadow fell over her blueprints. Valen stood across the marble slab. He wiped sweat and dirt from his brow. His bare chest was smeared with gray dust and drying mud. He looked entirely stripped of his arrogant past, rebuilt into something real and unbreakable. "The perimeter is stable," Valen reported, his voice a low rumble. "The nobility are exhausted, but they are digging." Sterling blistered his hands an hour ago. He has not complained. "Physical pain clarifies the mind," Lyra replied, marking a new line on the canvas. "It reminds them that gravity applies to everyone." Valen rested his hands on the edge of the marble slab. He studied her face, mapping the sharp focus in her silver eyes, the dark smudge of charcoal on her cheek, the relentless drive that had saved his life. "They look to you," Valen said softly. "The guards, the commoners, even the council. They do not fear my strength anymore. They revere your mind." Lyra paused her work. She met his intense gaze. "A city needs both. It needs the intellect to draw the lines and the strength to hold the stone." "I will hold whatever you build," Valen promised. He reached across the table, his calloused, dirt-stained fingers gently grazing her jaw. "But I need to know something. When the mud is cleared and the walls are raised, what happens to us?" Lyra looked at the Alpha King. The primal bond between them, once a source of bitter resentment, now pulsed with a steady grounding heat. He had proven his worth in the dark. He had bled for her grid. "We keep building," Lyra answered, turning her hand to interlock her fingers with his. "A true foundation is never finished." 6 months passed. The ruin of the Solstice Spire was completely cleared. The jagged chasm that had swallowed the throne room now served as the central shaft for a massive hydraulic elevator. Lyra did not rebuild a palace. She designed a civic city. It was a sprawling complex of dark ironwood, gray limestone, and exposed steel. It lacked the superficial gold of the old empire. It possessed the brutal, undeniable beauty of absolute function. The morning air was crisp. Lyra stood on the upper scaffolding overlooking the central plaza. She wore a heavy canvas coat against the chill, her silver eyes tracking the movement of a colossal iron gear. The gear was the final component of the primary water distribution hub. It would connect the deep subterranean reservoirs directly to the surface aqueducts, ensuring clean water for every sector. "Lower the main line," Lyra commanded over the din of the construction site. Below her on the plaza floor, Valen raised his arm. He stood among a crew of 50 men gripping a thick hemp rope. Half the men were former lower ward scavengers. The other half were former aristocrats. Lord Sterling stood 2 paces behind Valen, his velvet robes long gone. He wore a simple canvas tunic, his hands heavily wrapped in leather grips. He pulled the thick rope, his shoulders straining under the load. He did not complain. The earth had humbled him. The blisters on his palms had long since turned into hard, thick calluses. "Hold tension," Valen shouted, his voice carrying over the wind. The crew dug their boots into the stone, locking the heavy rope. The immense iron gear descended slowly from the wooden crane. It hovered exactly 2 inches above the central housing unit. Lyra climbed down the wooden ladder, her boots hitting the stone plaza. She walked to the center of the hub. She carried a heavy iron caliper, sliding it between the gear teeth and the housing rim. The math had to be flawless. A single millimeter of friction would shatter the axle under full hydrostatic load. The entire new infrastructure relied on this specific kinetic transfer point. She checked the clearance. Perfect alignment. "Drop it," Lyra said, stepping back from the housing. Valen gave the signal. The crew released the tension lock. The iron gear dropped into the housing slot with a deafening metallic clang. The solid stone plaza vibrated. The heavy locking pins slammed into place, securing the immense weight. Lyra walked to the primary flow valve. She grabbed the heavy iron wheel and turned it, using her entire body weight to break the initial seal. Deep beneath their feet, the diverted subterranean rivers surged. The water rushed up the vertical pipes, filling the central hub. The massive iron gear began to turn. It groaned, initially fighting the static friction, then smoothed into a rhythmic, steady hum. Fresh, clean water blasted from the 4 directional spillways, filling the surface canals perfectly. A massive cheer erupted from the crew. Commoners and former nobles slapped each other on the back, united by the shared triumph of manual labor. The rigid hierarchy of blood was permanently dead. The undeniable hierarchy of physical effort had completely replaced it. Valen walked through the cheering crowd. The men parted for him instantly. He stopped directly in front of Lyra. He carried a small, heavy object wrapped in dark cloth. He did not look like a fallen king. He looked like a towering sovereign of the earth, forged in sweat and heavy iron. "The distribution hub is fully operational," Valen said, his voice a low rumble. "The eastern plateau has clean water. The lower grid is secure. Your math held." The stone held, Lyra corrected, wiping a smear of dark grease from her cheek. "The math just gave it proper direction." Valen unwrapped the dark cloth. He held out a heavy collar made of pure black iron. It was completely devoid of jewels or intricate carvings. It was a simple geometric circle, forged directly from the melted remains of the shattered palace gate. "You refused a golden crown," Valen stated, looking deeply into her pale silver eyes. "You told me a crown cannot sit upon a rotting spine. This is not a crown. It is a brace. It is heavy. It requires raw strength to carry." Lyra looked at the iron collar. It was the absolute antithesis of the fragile aesthetic vanity she despised. It was a physical manifestation of load-bearing weight and enduring permanence. Valen took a step closer, his broad frame blocking the harsh morning sun. "I do not ask you to rule from a high tower," he whispered, his voice raw with absolute devotion. "I ask you to stand beside me in the dirt. I ask you to bind your geometric grid to my raw iron permanently." Lyra reached out, tracing the cold, smooth curve of the dark metal. She felt the profound, heavy weight of his promise. He was not claiming her as fragile property. He was offering his entire physical being as the foundational anchor for her brilliant mind. She bowed her head slightly. "Fasten it," she commanded. Valen stepped behind her. He placed the heavy iron collar around her neck, snapping the secure locking pin into place. The metal was cold against her skin, but it rapidly warmed, absorbing the heat of her physical body. It was heavy, grounding her perfectly to the earth. He turned her around, his calloused hands resting heavily on her shoulders. He leaned down, kissing her with a fierce, possessive heat that completely erased the chill of the morning air. It was a kiss built entirely on survival, mutual respect, and the absolute destruction of a corrupt world. When he pulled away, he looked out at the sprawling citadel of ironwood and gray stone. The water flowed efficiently. The workers rested in the sun. The earth beneath their boots was silent and flawlessly stable. "What do we call this new city?" Valen asked. Lyra stood tall, the heavy iron collar resting perfectly against her collarbone. She looked at the spinning gear pumping life into the newly unified sectors. The keystone, Lyra answered, because it holds everything together. They stood side by side watching the water run clear and strong over the heavy gray stone. The archaic past was permanently buried in the dark depths, and the structural future was perfectly geometrically secure. Frost coated the ironwood ramparts. The northern wind drove sheets of ice against the barricades. 5 years ago, a blizzard of this magnitude would have frozen the lower wards solid. The nobility would have burned their own furniture for warmth while the impoverished died in the streets. Tonight, the keystone barely registered the cold. Lyra walked the perimeter path. She wore a thick wool coat. The iron collar rested cold against her skin. She did not stay inside her heated drafting room during a storm. She inspected the joints. She tested the tension lines. A deep rumble echoed through the bedrock. It was a minor tectonic shift, a natural settling of the limestone plates beneath the city. Lyra felt the vibration travel up through her leather boots. She did not flinch. She closed her eyes. She felt the kinetic force disperse safely through the flexible ironwood joints she had integrated into the foundation. The outer wall swayed a fraction of an inch, absorbing the shock. It snapped back into perfect alignment. Citizens moved through the streets below. They carried crates of root vegetables and dried meats from the subterranean storehouses. No panic tainted the air. Redirected geothermal vents pumped heat beneath the paving stones. Snow melted upon contact with the rock. The water drained into the filtration grates, maintaining dry, warm streets while the blizzard raged outside the walls. Children ran through the open plazas, chasing each other. They did not look at the sky with terror. They trusted the roof above their heads. Lyra stopped at the western gate. Sterling stood near the primary relief valve. He wore a patched canvas coat. His face looked weathered and lined. He gripped a large iron wrench. The former head of the High Council now managed the western thermal grid. Stripped of his gold, he had discovered a profound talent for thermodynamics. The city ran on competence. The pressure climbed, Sterling said. He acknowledged her arrival with a brief nod. The subterranean aquifer is freezing. The ice expands against the bedrock. The load on the western wall increased 10% this hour. Lyra checked the brass gauge. Release the secondary vents, she instructed. Vent the excess steam into the outer trenches. Let the ice form a secondary defensive wall against the scavengers. Sterling locked the wrench onto the valve wheel. He hauled downward. He grunted. The muscles in his back strained against the rusted iron. Steam hissed from the vents. It blasted into the freezing night air. The moisture hit the frozen ground and solidified instantly. A smooth, treacherous glacier rapidly formed outside the gates. A tactical barrier, Sterling noted. He wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve. The scavengers lack the iron cleats to scale it. The storm does our fighting for us. The earth is the greatest weapon, Lyra replied. Respect its boundaries and it protects yours. Footsteps sounded on the stone stairs. Valen climbed to the ramparts. He carried a torch. The wind snapped the flame. He inspected the newly formed ice barrier and nodded. The outer perimeter is sealed, Valen announced. He planted the torch in an iron bracket. The scavenger clans abandoned the siege. They retreated into the mountain caves. They cannot survive the temperature drop. He looked at Sterling. Good work with the valves? Sterling inclined his head. I followed the math. Valen turned to Lyra. He held out his hand. The thermal exchange chamber is secure. The structural grid holds. Come inside before the wind freezes your blood. Lyra took his hand. His palm felt like a furnace. They descended the stone stairs. They walked through the streets, tracing the main aqueduct line back to the citadel. The citizens nodded to them as they passed. They offered no bows. They offered respect. A blacksmith hammered a new iron piton on his anvil. A baker handed Valen a fresh loaf of bread. The king accepted it, breaking it in half and sharing it with his mate as they walked. They belonged to the streets. The air inside the central chamber felt thick and warm. A massive oak drafting table dominated the room. Lyra unrolled a fresh canvas. Refugees arrived yesterday, Valen said. He shed his coat and threw it over a chair. They spoke of a falling kingdom in the south. The southern tectonic plates are shifting. Their marble towers are crumbling. Lyra picked up a stick of charcoal. We need to expand the residential grid. We build outward. Deep trenches, interlocking foundations. She drew a harsh black line across the canvas. Valen leaned over the table. You're designing an outer ring. An absorption ring, Lyra corrected. The southern refugees migrate here. We need space. We will not stack people like firewood. Every structure must anchor directly into the bedrock. We tie the new foundation into the existing aqueduct. It requires cutting through the solid granite ridge, Valen said. He tapped the map. It requires raw kinetic force, Lyra agreed. She set the charcoal down. She looked up into his silver eyes. Valen grinned. He gripped her waist. He lifted her effortlessly onto the edge of the drafting table. He stepped between her knees, resting his hands on her thighs. The arrogant Alpha King disappeared long ago. Only the builder remained. I will gather the mining crews at dawn, Valen promised. We break the granite ridge. We expand the grid. Lyra wrapped her arms around his neck. The iron collar brushed his collarbone. We build a world that never falls. Valen kissed her. The vow was sealed. Disclaimer: this video is a work of fiction, created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, settings, and events depicted are entirely imaginary and are not intended to represent real-life people or situations. Please view for entertainment purposes only.